At the brink of twilight in 1944, the fate of the war had undergone a metamorphosis. The Allied armies, like unstoppable titans, threatened the borders of the Reich from the eastern and western fronts. Meanwhile, the majestic capital, Berlin, lay reduced to rubble, subjected to incessant enemy bombardment. The inhabitants, emaciated by food shortages and the hardships of war, found no reason to celebrate the upcoming end-of-year festivities. The dark humor that once echoed in the streets of Berlin had transformed into grim wit, encapsulated in a joke circulating the city during those grim days. Be practical. Give a coffin as a gift. 2 years earlier, a seismic shift occurred in the German psyche just before the Christmas season of 1942, fueled by rumors that General Paulus's Sixth Army was encircled by the Red Army at the Volga. The Nazi leadership struggled to acknowledge the impending annihilation of the Wehrmacht's colossal formation amid the ruins of Stalingrad and the frozen steppe. In anticipation of delivering grim news, Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda and Information, declared a Teutonic Christmas in 1942, marked by frugality and unwavering ideological commitment. Candles replaced crowns and traditional melodies were eclipsed by renditions of Silent Night. By 1944, the memory of a traditional roasted goose had faded into oblivion, replaced by family letters about destroyed structures for sons returning from the front. Air raids, alternately orchestrated by the British at night and the Americans during the day, became so routine that Berliners found solace in basements and underground shelters, abandoning their beds. The lack of rest fueled a blend of repressed hysteria and fatalistic resignation. The fear of Gestapo reprisals for defeatist sentiments diminished, evident in the proliferation of jokes. The acronym LSR, originally meaning Luftschutzraum, air raid shelter, humorously transformed into Lerne schnell Russisch, learn Russian quickly. The Zoo Tower, Berlin's massive flak tower with rooftop batteries and ample shelters, loomed over the urban landscape. The prevailing atmosphere foretold an imminent societal and national breakdown. Berliners, convinced of their currency's impending devaluation, indulged in extravagant spending. Water shortages during air raids turned bathrooms into unattractive places. Authorities occasionally sealed washrooms due to a rise in suicides inside, a stark reflection of the city's torment. With insufficient shelters for a population of 3 million, foreign workers, distinguished by letters denoting their origin, were prohibited from underground shelters and subway basements. This directive, derived from Nazi racial doctrines and the perceived dispensability of Eastern workers, exacerbated the struggles faced by the diverse workforce. However, among foreign workers, some enjoyed greater autonomy and witnessed a change of fortune as the Red Army advanced. Berliners, however, clung to an ancestral and guttural fear of the Eastern Slavic intruder, an apprehension easily transformed into animosity. In February 1945, nerves were already frayed and the citizens of the Reich were still unaware of what was to come. It was a clear, frigid winter night in the German city of Dresden when, just after 9 p.m., the early warning sirens began to wail. As usual, the inhabitants headed to the basements of their homes or the few available bunkers for shelter. It was practically part of their routine, a routine that several German cities had experienced since the start of the Second World War in 1939. However, that night of February 13, 1945, would be different. This time it was not just another attack. Without even anticipating it, the residents of Dresden would become the victims of one of the most brutal and deadly attacks perpetrated by the Allies, particularly by the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces. The second wave of attacks on Dresden began at 1:23 a.m. Without electricity, the sirens had to be manually operated. By that hour, the city's fire was so fierce it could be seen from 100 kilometers away. The smoke column rose to 4,600 meters. Firefighting operations had to be halted, and the high temperatures melted glass and metal. At the central station Hauptbahnhof, the barbarity exceeded anything imaginable. Refugees crammed into freight cars, others packed the corridors and tunnels. 2 trains had just arrived from Königsbruck with hundreds of children who had been evacuated to the east and were now being evacuated again to save them from the approaching Russian army. With the first incendiary bombs, the corridors and tunnels flooded with smoke. In the words of journalist Philip Knightley, the flames devoured all organic matter in their path. In the words of journalist Philip Knightley, the flames devoured all the organic matter in their path. Everything that was combustible burned. The next day, American planes arrived to strafe the survivors trying to reach the banks of the Elbe. The city was without light and water. In the absence of shelters or concrete bunkers, people, in their desperation, sought refuge in the basements of old buildings. For many, what was meant to protect them ended up literally crushing them, collapsing on their heads. Others succumbed to the heat, with oxygen running out and only carbon monoxide left to breathe. The place they had chosen for protection had, in fact, become an oven. Hell seized the ancient German city. Streets that were once bustling turned into a ghostly quarry in just 20 minutes, echoing with wails, heart-wrenching cries, delayed explosions, and occasionally the dull crash of subsequent collapses. One of the British pilots who participated in the attack on Dresden on the night of February 14th remarked, "Hell, as we Christians imagine it, must be something like this. That night I became a pacifist." Then came the challenge of removing the bodies buried under hundreds of kilos of rubble, identifying the corpses and giving them a proper burial. As the weather changed, the stench became unbearable. The city's cemetery was overwhelmed, and the survivors' strength was depleted. Identifying women proved more complicated than men. Their documents were in purses left far from their bodies or confused with those of other victims. At one point, it was decided to enter the basements where dozens of bodies still lay and use flamethrowers to cremate them on site. At that moment, Churchill wrote a letter to his top commanders. "I understand it is crucial to focus on military targets, such as oil plants and communications immediately adjacent to the combat zone, rather than carrying out acts of terror and destruction, however impressive they may seem." The final months of the Second World War were passing, months in which the German forces, in a desperate resistance, tried to delay the overwhelming superiority of the Soviet offensive, which, like an unstoppable roller, advanced towards the eastern territories of the German Reich. On the battlefields, where the shouts of soldiers hardened by war once echoed, now resounded the footsteps of brave old men and children called to defend an exhausted homeland. The futile sacrifices only fueled discontent among the population, who began to sympathize with the idea of giving refuge to deserters. A Polish farmer who was in Berlin on January 24th witnessed women shouting at officers and non-commissioned officers, leading a column of German soldiers down the street, "Let our husbands come home and send the senior Nazis in their place." Due to the shortage of men available for the front, the preparation of improvised recruit units began the previous autumn. With most German men between 17 and 45 already recruited, the Volkssturm became a mix of teenagers and elderly men, forming an improvised last line of defense. Goebbels, Reich Defense Commissioner in Berlin, led an intense propaganda campaign to boost fervor and loyalty, showing images of elderly men and young boys marching together in formation and receiving military instruction to defend the National Socialist cause. The soldiers' morale at the front did not experience a boost despite all these initiatives. Many were horrified to learn from letters they received from home that their fathers, and in some cases even their grandfathers or younger brothers, were being trained for combat week after week. In reality, most Germans displayed great skepticism, partly due to their proverbial respect for professional specialization. Despite their efforts, the Volkssturm was doomed to fail, as its men were not provided with food rations, forcing them to depend on their families for sustenance. Defense commanders soon recognized that the World War I veterans were the only ones with a certain sense of duty, while most of the recruits slipped away whenever they had the chance. Another of the paramilitary groups desperately created at the end of the war was the werewolf guerrillas. Himmler moved to his headquarters in Hohenleichen to receive information about the Werwolf project. Accompanied by Prützmann and other high-ranking SS military officials, Himmler expressed the intention to create and organize a resistance movement in Germany. Nevertheless, according to Skorzeny, from the outset, Himmler expressed skepticism about the plan's chances of success. The war, a voracious devourer of generations, had transformed the army into an amalgamation of those who had seen more winters than battles. Among the old warriors, whose wrinkles told stories of bygone eras, and the young who barely understood the weight of a rifle, an echo of resistance emerged. Initially, Werwolf recruits came from the Waffen-SS, the army, the Hitler Youth, the gendarmerie, and the Gestapo. But as time passed, the military crisis deepened, and the shortage of resources became acute. The recruits became increasingly younger. Many boys ended up sacrificing their lives, often in vain. As the Werwolf project progressed, various groups and personalities within the monumental bureaucratic apparatus of the Third Reich became involved in this initiative, as was common with all new ventures of the Hitlerian Empire. Almost simultaneously with Prützmann's werewolves, the Nutcracker project emerged, led by Arthur Axmann, head of the Hitler Youth. Its purpose was to train members over 14 years old in guerrilla warfare tactics. Although the Nutcracker project was absorbed by Prützmann's group in January 1945, those young people who did not receive training, either due to lack of time or being under 14 years old, were encouraged to carry out sabotage actions. These improvised recruits, mobilized in a last desperate effort, often found themselves without adequate training and lacking sufficient equipment. At that time, young people matured in a year, a month, or even during a single battle. Unfortunately, many did not survive that first confrontation. Determined to prove they could act as superior to veterans, some of whom could be their fathers in age, they displayed a reckless bravery that had its consequences. The final assault on Germany was being prepared. The villages of East Prussia, which until a few months ago regarded the war as something distant, now saw it looming over them in all its harshness. The Soviet soldiers had painted phrases like "Forward to the fascists' lair" or "Revenge and death to the German invaders" on their tank turrets. They encountered little resistance as the T-34S and Stalin heavy tanks advanced at 2 in the afternoon. The frost covering their hulls provided them with effective camouflage in the field stretching before them. The advance of Soviet forces through East Prussia and the fear of atrocities they committed in the first occupied villages triggered panic in the region. The situation for Germany became dramatic due to the desperate flight of hundreds of thousands of refugees, women, children, and the elderly. Under infernal weather conditions, with a winter of freezing temperatures, they began their exodus, abandoning the homes of their ancestral homeland. In overcrowded trains, marching on snow-covered roads or frozen lakes, and under the constant threat of Russian aviation and tanks, desperate crowds attempted to reach the Baltic ports. For them, a ship represented safety and an escape route to freedom, taking them westward. In this land exodus towards the Baltic, the casualties from cold, hunger, disease, and warfare numbered in the hundreds of thousands. By March 4th, Soviet tanks had penetrated to the mouth of the Oder in Stettin, reaching the Baltic and cutting off land evacuation routes to the west. For the nearly 2 million Germans still in Pomerania and the Bay of Danzig, there was only one escape route left to freedom: the path over the Baltic Sea. In the final weeks of the war, although there was no clearly defined eastern or western front, even in the atomized warfare with isolated conflict hotspots, there were still soldiers willing to resist for as long as possible. Despite the growing scarcity of weapons, ammunition, and fuel, small groups continued to fight. Those born in 1926 or later were known as the Flakhelfer generation, having grown up with the Hitler Youth and participated as anti-aircraft helpers in the air defense artillery as children. Due to their complete indoctrination under the National Socialists, these young soldiers were routinely used as the last and often fanatical individuals available for sacrifice in defensive battles and last stands. In these final days of the war, the common image was of 16 or 17-year-olds with rolled-up sleeves and uniforms that no longer fit, fighting not just for their country, but for the only regime they had ever known. The greatest fear among Germans, both soldiers and civilians, was the approaching Red Army. After 3.5 years of a war of attrition, or rather a war of annihilation, Vernichtungskrieg, against the Soviet Union and specifically its Slavic people, the fear of revenge could hardly be considered unfounded. However, the violence of the Soviet soldiers, primarily directed at German women, was more a reflection of the troops' barbarity than a politically motivated act. As soon as it was known that Soviet troops were approaching, the civilian population massively fled westward. By early March 1945, nearly 8.5 million people had left the eastern regions of Germany. Additionally, about 1.5 million internally displaced persons came from western cities that had since fallen into the hands of the Americans and British. Moreover, nearly 5 million elderly women and children had escaped the air raids on their cities by taking refuge in the surrounding countryside, while the roar of Soviet artillery and the drone of Allied bomber units filled most Germans with terror. For others, those same sounds were signals of hope. Above all, those imprisoned in concentration camps and other Nazi camps for forced labor or political prisoners longed for liberation and ultimately saw those Allied incursions as a chance for survival. The predominant desire of Germans at that time, both troops and civilians, was to see the British and American armies advance eastward as quickly as possible, reaching Berlin and occupying most of the country before the Soviets could surpass the Oder line. Few were willing to collaborate with Hitler's purpose of obstructing through self-destruction. On March 19th, the eve of the crossing of the Rhine, Hitler issued an order declaring that the battle should be conducted without regard to our own population. The massive mobilization of men to the front had left a palpable void in cities and towns. Streets once full of life now resonated with an unsettling silence. Women, the elderly and children witnessed the depletion of resources and the disorganization prevailing in a society overwhelmed by the devastating consequences of the conflict. Food scarcity stood as an omnipresent specter, an intangible enemy lurking in every corner. Empty shelves in stores, once stocked with a variety of products, testified to the harshness of the situation. Rations became increasingly scarce, and the population faced the daily challenge of finding food to survive. Agriculture, torn apart by the demands of the war, could not meet the needs of a starving nation. Administrative disorganization and the lack of logistical resources exacerbated the crisis. Infrastructure collapsed, communications became chaotic, and bureaucracy plunged into anarchy. The governmental machinery, once efficient, was now overwhelmed by the magnitude of the tragedy. Authorities struggled to provide basic services, while the population faced a reality where normalcy had completely disappeared. The economic collapse manifested in the rapid devaluation of the currency. Money, once a symbol of prosperity, lost its value at an alarming rate. The runaway inflation contributed to the widespread feeling that economic stability was a distant memory. People, impoverished by circumstances, saw their savings evaporate in the blink of an eye. Distrust and fear spread like a social virus. Contradictory information and government censorship generated skepticism among the population. Propaganda, which had once effectively influenced the masses, now faced skepticism and resistance from those seeking the truth amid the confusion. By April 1945, practically all Germans were aware that the military adventure Hitler had started in 1939 was about to end. The disintegration of the country brought with it the virtual absence of news, as newspapers and other media that could have offered some insight into what was really happening had disappeared. In this vacuum, only war propaganda continued to exert enormous influence over Germans' perception of reality. Hitler's birthday, Friday, April 20th, 1945. A sunny day dawns on Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday. Amidst ruined buildings, the party flags rise above the rubble, proclaiming Die Kriegsstadt Berlin grüßt den Führer. Although in previous years, congratulations flooded the Reich Chancellery in 1945, few packages and letters arrived, reflecting the desolation of the city and the scarcity of resources, even at the Berlin Zoo, where many animals suffered from starvation. Goering was awakened that morning at Karinhall, his country house north of Berlin, by the barrage that opened Rokossowski's offensive. Outside was a convoy of Luftwaffe trucks, which were needed for more urgent tasks, loaded with the loot he had gathered. A detachment of motorcyclists would escort him south. The Reichsmarschall dedicated a few words to the soldiers and saluted them as they departed. Himmler had returned to the Hohenleichen sanatorium the previous night, and at midnight he had champagne brought to toast the Führer. Goebbels, the only member of the Nazi leadership willing to stay with the Führer in Berlin until the bitter end, gave a birthday speech that morning, asking all Germans to blindly believe in their leader, who would ultimately lead them through the hardships. The more cautious housewives began packing their suitcases with essential provisions, anticipating the imminent battle and seeking refuge in basements to survive. Civilian casualties were numerous. Women waiting in line for food formed ranks like Napoleonic infantry, enduring even after a shell explosion decimated the line they were in. It was said they cleaned the blood off their ration cards and kept going. "They stand like walls," noted a Berliner in her diary, recalling how they used to run for shelter in the bunkers at the sight of fighter planes in the central German sky. Women queued for a ration of butter or sausage, while men went out only to get a turn for a shot of schnapps. This contrast symbolized the women's immediate concern for survival, while men sought to escape the war's consequences. Germans appeared famished, visibly worn by their suffering. Berlin was not a pretty city. Its streets were narrow and filled with barricades, broken trams, and other vehicles. Houses were empty because everyone had taken refuge in the basements. During the retreat to central Berlin, SS execution squads carried out their grim duties with increasing urgency and insensitivity. Around Kurfürstendamm, they entered houses displaying white flags to shoot anyone they found inside. Horrified by the collapse's momentum, Goebbels described these signs of surrender as a pestilential bacillus. However, General Mummert, commander of the Müncheberg Panzer Division, ordered SS squads and the Feldgendarmerie in his sector to surround Anhalter Station and Potsdamer Platz, threatening to execute the executioners on the spot. Conditions gradually worsened for those caught in the fighting. German soldiers rarely found themselves near a water pump, forcing them to quench their thirst, exacerbated by smoke and dust, by drinking from the canals. Cases of nervous collapse due to the combination of exhaustion and constant artillery fire multiplied. To maintain resistance, Bormann, like Goebbels and Ribbentrop, spread the false rumor of a deal with the Western Allies. "Stand firm. Fight with fanaticism," he ordered the Gauleiter in the early hours of April 26th. "We are not giving up. We have no intention of surrendering. We are aware of the evolution of foreign policy. Heil Hitler." Signed, Reichsleiter Bormann. The lie was soon highlighted by Hitler and Goebbels' reaction to Himmler's attempts to seek a true ceasefire with the Western powers. In Hamburg on May 1, 1945, Wagner's music played on the radio. The music was abruptly interrupted. A subdued voice announced that significant news would be broadcast in a few minutes. It was 9:30 p.m. The word spread across Germany. In almost every house in the country, people sat still, eyes fixed on their radios. By that point, they knew that no news could be good news. More than an hour after the announcement, after Bruckner's music, Admiral Karl Dönitz's voice came on, solemn with sadness and worry evident in every syllable. The certainties of the past had vanished. German men and women, soldiers of our armed forces, our Führer, Adolf Hitler, has fallen. He stated that Hitler had died fighting the enemy, without providing many details about the circumstances of his death. He clarified that he had been designated as the successor, insisted on the need to defend against the Bolsheviks, and said the fight would continue. Germans knew this signified the end. What they had imagined, despite the misinformation they lived under, had become reality. The war was about to end, and they would be at the mercy of their enemies. Dönitz spared them the truth that Hitler had taken his own life, not wanting to demoralize them further. In Demmin, something terrifying happened, leading the population to face a situation of horror over 3 days. In 1945, Demmin was a small enclave of 15,000 inhabitants. 156 kilometers north of Berlin, in what is now Western Pomerania. In 3 days, over 10% of its inhabitants had taken their own lives. On the afternoon of April 30th, several white flags flew from public buildings in Demmin and from the steeple of its main church. 3 Soviet negotiators, including a German officer, approached to promise that the city's inhabitants would not be disturbed and that there would be no looting if Demmin surrendered without a fight. They were killed by Hitler Youth snipers. Rolf Dietrich Schulz, who was 9 years old then, testified many years later that he had seen and heard Gerhard Moldenhauer, a fervent National Socialist and local schoolteacher, telling a neighbor, "I just shot my wife and 3 children. Now I only want to take out some Russians." That evening, after a falsely calm sunset, the Soviets looted and set fire to the city in a frenzy of violence that lasted through 3 terrible days. They raped almost all the women and shot any Germans who dared protest. 80% of the city was destroyed by flames. The Russians poured gasoline on the walls of houses and stood guard to prevent the fires from being extinguished. There were mass executions, summary shootings, and continuous looting by drunken soldiers who had stormed a couple of distilleries and several liquor stores. In Demmin, this feeling of disillusioned despair, resigned desperation, and fascination with death materialized shockingly, influenced by Nazi fanaticism, the certainty of disaster with the arrival of Soviet troops, guilt over war crimes and massacres in Nazi extermination camps in Europe, creating a sort of collective hysteria.